Not investing in brand storytelling, huge one, I think. I think you've had a few guests on, I've watched it where you've talked about this, but the industry is transforming fast. I think customers need that kind of clear narrative about how providers are adapting, the people behind the business, not necessarily the long history of the business, but what's driving them forward, what makes them different ultimately. But I think there's that brand storytelling piece I think is lacking, especially in the DC industry across what I mentioned before, which is kind of endemic, talking about features instead of outcomes and solutions, missing that chance to position your company as a growth enabler rather than a cost center. And then also overlooking the human element. We are all people at the end of the day, and we're emotional people, and that piece is sometimes missing, I think. And it's something that I always try to fall back on. Things like talent development and partnerships and the people that drive our business forward on a daily basis. We wouldn't be where we are today without those people. So I think that's a really competitive differentiator that sometimes is missed. Hi, it's Robb Shingles, Group Head of Marketing for WB Power Services, now proudly part of Rehlko Power Systems, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, and today I'm thrilled to be welcoming all the way from the UK, Robb Shingles, who is the Group Head of Marketing for WB Power Services and now part of Rehlko Power Systems. Robb, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for joining me. And I'm super curious to find out how you ended up in a marketing role in the data center industry, specifically working in the power and energy segment.
Well, where do we start? So, I thought just before we dive into that, I could give you a bit of an introduction to WB, because they've been on a bit of a journey like myself. So they started in 1983. They've grown from very much an acorn into a huge oak tree. I think they went from, when I started in 2020, they went from 27 million to just shy of 200 million in sort of 5-6 years. So huge growth, kind of driven by healthcare, data centers. There's many critical sectors, not just in data centers. And my kind of journey has been almost as interesting. So I started in a construction industry marketing role, where I got kind of exposed to the route to market for construction firms in terms of going through that process, that tender process, working with main contractors and stuff. And then so that transitioned really well into the data center market, the way that we approach the market with, tendering, main contractors, procurement teams, subcontractors as well. So yeah, it's been a hell of a journey for us as a business and for myself. And obviously, with the growth that WB Power Services, now part of Rehlko, as you said, experience, we started off in smaller critical sectors. We organically grew. That kind of evolved into smaller kind of edge data center jobs with some smaller tier 2 and tier 1 contractors. And that through a bit of luck, which businesses always need, as well as really sort of savvy investment and going after the right sectors at the right time, we pushed more into the colocation market, and now we're proudly part of Rehlko as of August 2025, making Rehlko one of the few OEMs to offer that true end-to-end service in the EMEA region, all the way from that kind of initial design through to long-term maintenance. All that acquisition is all aimed to scale Rehlko's ability to execute those really complex data center projects. Trying to strengthen its leadership in one of the fastest growing sectors. So it's been a really interesting journey, all the way from my first day at WB Power Services in 2019. Starting off in the rental market and smaller industrial jobs, all the way now to some of the stuff that we're doing in the co-location market now. It's been a real ride.
You can say that again. It's interesting time too, because you joined maybe a little bit before, a couple of years before OpenAI really unleashed this whole generative AI tsunami on the industry with growth. So you were doing marketing and construction. Was this a construction company that was building data centers? Were they involved in mission critical, or?
It was always it was construction. primarily, it was building. Yeah, so it was, but it wasn't just data centers. It was, it was hospitals, it was manufacturing facilities. But like I said, the exposure that I got to that construction process in the UK, we use something called RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects. So that standard, all the way from early feasibility through to like spatial planning, concept design, technical design, project installation, and then long-term maintenance. That kind of band, that standard is what I understood as part of my previous role in construction. And then obviously, we utilize that in the UK in our DC project. So there was that kind of transition of knowledge that gave me, a foundational understanding of that kind of go-to-market strategy and how we target people at different stages of the journey. When we're talking to market advisors at the start and land agents, all the way through to, your M&E consultants, your contractors, and then your kind of FMs and your kind of operating expenditure people focused at the other end of the markets, at the other end of the journey. So it gave me that kind of foundational knowledge that allowed me to kind of transition into data centers and of course our other sectors that we work in as well. So it served me well to transition.
What's especially interesting about that, coming from the perspective of construction and then moving into more power and energy, we segment up the data center industry into the data center operators, data center technology companies as kind of the second segment, data center facilities. We put construction together with real estate and investors, and then outsource sales and marketing companies. So coming from the perspective of building data centers and other mission critical industrial facilities and getting exposure to the mechanical and electrical and the facility side, you're already bridging construction into the facility segment. We track about a dozen different facilities related companies in this area as well. So it seemed to be really, really fortuitous. Did you always know that you wanted to get into some facet of marketing, concentrating on this particular niches? Did when you in school, did you get a degree in marketing or?
No, less said about my school time, the better, to be honest, I think. Troublesome, I think you define. No, I always enjoyed, going really, really far back, always enjoyed business orientated, sort of the curriculum around business studies. And then, went and did business management at university, enjoyed marketing as a module. And then kind of, post university, as a lot of kids do, wasn't 100% sure what we wanted to do, enjoyed marketing, so took the plunge, took an entry-level job, and have kind of, obviously, the rest is history. That marketing is kind of my raison d'etre now. It's all it's what I live and breathe. I can't imagine doing anything else, to be honest.
And the longer you've been in the space, the more likely you've seen seismic shifts. When I started doing marketing and I was in college, it was pre-web. So we did a lot of field marketing. We held a lot of campus events. This was focusing on higher education for IBM and the IBM Windows ecosystem. And we did a lot of collaboration. We did a lot of bartering deals, and specifically segmenting around education and early evangelism. But I was also heavily involved in the early days of the web, and Web 0.0, and the first blogs and the first email marketing and building the first websites. And I remember when YouTube and LinkedIn was a novelty. Now it's a huge, huge core part of the B2B technology. I actually can't imagine the digital infrastructure space growing nearly as rapidly as it is right now without LinkedIn. I can't see that X or Twitter would have figured out B2B. Meta's been trying to figure it out for decades and they haven't gotten quite right, but LinkedIn really nailed it. And they just getting started in the early to mid 2000s.
Yeah, I can't profess to be working when the web started, but I certainly see the huge shift. Obviously, the last few years with the kind of the all-consuming nature of AI and how much it infiltrates all of our different channels now. Obviously, in marketing, it's so prolific already. I think our kind of main focus is how we what's the word I'm looking for? How we harness it. How we harness it is in our internal systems, in our go-to-market strategy. In terms of even down to like the nitty-gritty of how AI is changing search behavior and how people find things online, and it's how you restructure all of your content, your thought leadership pieces to be much more focused around that kind of AI optimization rather than traditional, methods of search and search engine marketing. So it's cataclysmic shifts, which is kind of forcing us to rethink our entire hypothesis around, digital disciplines.
Oh yeah, we're seeing the exact same thing. If I think about in the mid 2010s, all the research from like Gartner and Serious Decisions and Salesforce for like half of a journey was over before sales contact. Now it's like almost the entire journey is over before sales contact. And it makes it so much more important for folks like us to figure out how to take all the thought leadership in your company and get it out there exposed for people that are doing research early on that don't want to talk to a human but are learning. And if you can figure out a way to insert yourself in that learning, you're golden. You can help shape the criteria. If you don't and you're invisible, not so much.
Well, that's what we've tried to do at WB and Rehlko. I like to think we've done relatively well. Is really mapping out that those decision making units across that entire journey and tying it back into that what I talk about, that RIBA project standard. At that feasibility stage, what are the audiences that we can be engaging with? What are the touch points? What are the stumbling blocks, milestones, all that kind of stuff? And how does that translate to, content? And following that discipline all the way through, from, like I said, really early stage one feasibility, understanding how those units interact, where the messaging changes, where we need to be positioned, what the touch points are. And then also, what systems we can use to try and measure what we're doing, because as we know, data centers, they don't pop up overnight. The sales cycles can be long and difficult to navigate. So and the touch points can be really varied. So you've got to have that infrastructure in place to try and capture that and understand it, so you can ultimately justify ROI and justify spend, which is what every marketer strives for.
Yeah, it sounds like you're doing an amazing job with understanding the journey and getting in there early, getting in there often, being really client-centric, focusing on pivoting your team members to be seen more like teachers and trusted advisors and experts as opposed to just vendors. But yeah, it's a big challenge, big issue. I talk to so many sales professionals and they talk about their first interactions and like, oh, they'll visit us at the booth, or we'll get them to attend a golf tournament or a cocktail party that they're sponsoring. I'm like, do you really understand? Have you thought about what the IT professionals, the engineers and construction folks that you're selling to actually are looking for early on? Because
so I think that is quite an old, like the way I look at exhibitions now is different. So a few years ago when I was a bit greener, I probably would have thought, oh, we will measure this event or exhibition purely on the number of leads that attend the booth that are new. Whereas now I see it as a really, really important, not only obviously it's really important that we measure those leads that come on the stand, but also it's a huge element of the return here is the engagement with existing customers and making sure that when we see them at these events, we're logging that as an interaction, because they all have, over time, all of these little touch points are pivotal, are really important, and to have that all kind of that understanding of all those touch points that you've had with that customer across that lifetime, rather than treating the event as just new leads. I think you've got to look at it a lot more holistically, and see it as not an individual piece of activity, but as part of a journey. That's one thing I think that I've really changed my perception on seeing it as much more of a long-term effort rather than an individual. Right, we'll do this event and we'll get this return specifically off the event. You've got to look broader, if you get what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've been seeing for a while that a lot of companies struggle with the before and the after, and even to a certain degree the during at these events. I always talk about, like, first make sure there's a good ICP match, ideal client profile match, and targeted buyer personas, that you have at least 60-80% overlap, so their demographics line up with yours. But I think what's, for a lot of people, what tends to be really important is their ability to educate and build trust at that event. And it's tough to do it just from the stand. So if you don't have a leader from your company that's actually speaking organically from the stage, ideally with their own session, not sharing it with 5 or 6 other people at a good time slot in the event, it can be tough to gauge whether you're really moving. Events, I think, are phenomenal. The tough part with events is the holy grail is most people, what they really need is more educational session minutes with people from their target account list. Ideally, the decision-making committee from the target account list. And what we're seeing increasingly is that's best accomplished with hosting an event where you get to decide who gets to get who gets invited, what you talk about, the time of day, everything, where you control everything. And it looks a lot more like hosting your own micro events. And everyone's like, well, no, events are really complicated and really expensive. I'm like, I don't know. A lot of people, if they have a classroom or a conference room or can handle doing webinars, they have a lot more of the building blocks than they likely realize.
Yeah, so again, that's those kind of more intimate events are a pivotal piece of our marketing mix. We not only do we do kind of your lunch and learns and your CPD, which I'm not sure if you have that in the US, but it's continuing professional development. So accreditations, that kind of stuff. So providing customers and prospects and long-term partners a space to come together, not only to do for there to be some learning in there, but also just to connect on a more personal level. I know it sounds frivolous, but it's really important. Gone are the days in marketing where you can just talk about features. It's got to be more about the outcomes and the solutions and the relationships you build.
It's funny. Not only do I get a lot more people, both clients and people that have come on the podcast, talking about the extreme value that they get from hosting breakfast seminars and lunch and learns and user groups and meetups. I see people making real estate decisions now when they're going to move into a new facility or a new office building or something. And I advise the same thing even on the colocation side, that if you can put aside 1,000 square feet to be able to host events with a couple of dozen people, and you can get your sales and your marketing team using that room for several time slots a week, half a day here, a couple hours here and there, hosting some events in the evening. The ROI on it is staggering when you can host events where you're not paying hotel and convention center prices for food and coffee. And it's really out of pocket. Once you already have good email marketing and a good CRM, your out of pocket costs are almost nothing. So it's really just the creativity and the priority of getting the subject matter experts in front of the right audiences on a consistent basis to, I don't want to say monopolize their journey, but have a lot of surface area on those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decisions.
Yeah, and we do. Yeah, obviously, like I said, we do a lot of that stuff with existing customers and long-term kind of prospects, but we also do a lot of stuff with graduates as well. So when we've got a kind of a graduate intake for some of our main customers, whether they're kind of tier ones or consultants, we partner with some of these consultants to do kind of periodic CPDs with these graduates, because they're going through a graduate scheme, so it's going to be some time before they're in that position to make decisions that could influence your business and your kind of your ROI. But it's again, with data centers, it's a longer term investment. You can't expect to see return immediately. It's all about that longer term investment and building that journey and building those touch points for a long term engagement program.
And for people that sell co-location, they may come across great prospects who are in like month 4 of a 36-month lease. Talk about a long sales cycle.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
So Rob, you mentioned graduates and you mentioned education. When you come across students in their formative years, high school, university age, maybe late teens, early 20s, and they're looking to you for advice on what they should be thinking about with a career in marketing and something related to digital infrastructure, even maybe adjacent to marketing and sales or product management or account management or something like that, what would you talk about with that person over breakfast or lunch when they're looking for some insights on what they could do to potentially replicate your success, or where you think the hot areas are going to be a couple of years out from now?
To be honest, I think what I kind of already touched on, really. I think this sounds very obvious when I say it, but really understanding your customers, really getting under the skin of that journey from, if I go through the AIDA model, initial awareness when they're coming into, or even prior to them coming into market. How do you build that that kind of that program of awareness, so you're kind of you're front of mind when that flashpoint comes, and they realize they require your services, and then into the interest stage, how you differentiate yourself and kind of ultimately make them desire your product or service, and then and then into action. So how do you convert them? I think that understanding that journey from your customer's perspective, and really understanding throughout that journey where those trigger points are, what as they progress, what the milestones are, what stumbling blocks they might encounter, and trying to leverage that with the appropriate activity. That's always what I think about, and that's been my going through the rigmarole of working from a very, very entry level marketing job to where I am now. I think that's the kind of the ethos that I've always had is really trying to understand that journey of a customer all the way from cradle to grave, because ultimately you can sell, you can talk features, you can talk about product, and that's obviously a kind of endemic across marketing, but you need for us especially, we need to be talking about outcomes and solutions, and that kind of much more what's the word I'm looking for, the orientation has got to be much more around the value that you add as part of that solution rather than just a feature of a product, and you can only do that by understanding that holistic journey. So that's the advice.
It sounds like for someone that's looking at a half a dozen potential employers, either through campus recruiting or just strictly looking at job postings or looking for internships or looking for a potential boss or company to bet their career on, it sounds like the key thing to look for is journey marketing, life cycle marketing, full life cycle, pre-sales.
Yeah, I think so.
Late stage, post-sales.
Yeah, and I also, I mean, this is just my personal preference, and what I've done, which I really, really have enjoyed, is I've been fortunate to work for businesses where, and this is both a blessing and a curse. Some people may completely disagree and may choose to go the other way. But what I've enjoyed is being in companies where the exposure to marketing is not in a specific channel initially. It's a full 360 role where you're working across digital, offline, lots of different disciplines and channels. You're kind of working across that entire funnel. So you're working all the way from a broader awareness, market proposition and brand proposition through that engagement piece and all the way out to kind of lead gen. So the variation, is the spice of life. That kind of understanding, and seeing that full kind of marketing funnel and that full customer journey, I think will allow someone to really nail down where their passion lies. And it may lie in a specific channel, or it may lie across that whole journey like mine. It's a preference, but I think giving yourself exposed to that sort of broader level of marketing activity and that journey is really kind of healthy.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
I think a lot of it may have to do as well with the size of company you're working for. Like you mentioned, when you first joined WB Power, they were at 20 million pound turnover, growing to roughly 10x that in a period of a couple of years. In a relatively small company where you may be the entire marketing team, you have to wear so many different hats, so many different roles, which at times can be insanely challenging. But you get to understand everything from start to finish. Whereas if you're working in a marketing organization where there's 6 layers between you and the CMO and there's 300 people in marketing, like you're a lot more pigeonholed and can have a very different experience. So that's, I think, something also that a lot of people don't think that much about, is the small company versus mid-sized company versus enterprise experience in marketing.
Yeah, and like I say, it's all down to preference, but for me, it's been that exposure early to lots of different disciplines, and that full full customer life cycle has given me such a strong, what I like to think, relatively successful, sort of CV and exposure has been really healthy for my broader marketing understanding, and the disciplines that I can pull through and utilize in day-to-day work now is so much broader because of that experience and that exposure.
Rob, what about someone that has been working in marketing, demand generation in some facet of digital infrastructure, data centers for at least 8, 10, 12 years? Maybe it's someone that you knew from earlier on in your career, haven't seen in a while, you bump into at a conference or the airport, and you sense when you're catching up with them over coffee or lunch that they seemed a little bit burned out, and they ask you for some advice about how to get their career back on track, how to pivot, how to reset. What would you talk about with that former colleague, friend over?
I think it's no secret that obviously the data center industry is evolving incredibly fast, with AI and sustainability pressures and stuff like that. So I think if you're looking to pivot, I think the most powerful thing you can probably do is try and translate your deep kind of legacy knowledge into more kind of future facing value. Position yourself as someone who's got experience, but you can bridge that gap between traditional data center operations and the emerging technologies. So don't reinvent yourself, but try and reframe yourself. Obviously, the market's always hungry for new talent, but it's also hungry for seasoned kind of marketing professionals who can guide transformation as the industry progresses and expands and evolves. They can guide that transformation kind of through the versatile and evolving industry. I think that's probably what I'd say.
When you look at what your colleagues are accomplishing or struggling with in other parts of the data center industry, especially in marketing related roles, what do you see as the biggest challenge or problem, and what do you wish they would approach just a little bit differently to have some more meaningful success?
Not investing in brand storytelling, a huge one, I think. I think you've had a few guests on I've watched, where you've talked about this, but the industry is transforming fast. I think customers need that kind of clear narrative about how providers are adapting, the people behind the business, not necessarily the kind of the long history of the business, but what's driving them forward, what makes them different ultimately. But I think that there's that brand storytelling piece I think is lacking in especially in the DC industry across the industry. What I mentioned before, which is kind of endemic, talking about features instead of outcomes and solutions. Missing that chance to position your company as a growth enabler rather than a cost center, and then also overlooking the human element. We are all people at the end of the day, and we're emotional people, and that kind of that piece is sometimes missing, I think, and it's something that I always try to fall back on. Things like talent development and partnerships and the people that drive our business forward on a daily basis. We wouldn't be where we are today without those people. So I think that's a really competitive differentiator that sometimes is missed, I think.
What's your take on how well marketers are doing with building their own professional brand as opposed to just building up their company's brand storytelling? There's different schools of thought and different norms throughout the industry. And I used to think this was a US versus other parts of the world issue, but it seems to be more data center operators compared to the rest of the data center industry, where there's a lot of restrictions on marketing and sales professionals being able to share candidly on LinkedIn and social media and YouTube, and even being able to participate in speaking opportunities and podcasts. Have you seen much of that, or able to draw up any kind of meaningful insights on what you think is going on? Curious to get your take on professional branding as opposed to the company branding. In other words, when you look at someone like yourself that works in marketing in around the data center facilities related sector related to energy and power, there seems to be a much more green light globally for folks like yourself to participate in speaking on panels and speaking at webinars and being interviewed on podcasts, whereas data center operators seem to be a lot more restrictive on who's allowed to participate in these kinds of thought leadership experiences to grow the company's brand, to grow the professional brand. Have you observed that in your own experience, or do you think there's another dynamic that's going on that either encourages or precludes more people from getting involved in building a professional brand?
We've got several people in the business who are prolific within the industry. That they work across accrediting bodies. They work at they work within kind of conferences, and they do a lot of piece, particularly around sustainability and modular systems and emerging technologies in the data center industry. In terms of kind of the restrictions and the reticence for data center professionals, I mean, I think one of my main challenges in the data center industry has always been around documenting some of the work we do. Naturally, it's there's a reticence to get into the nuts and bolts of what we do, but we can find a happy medium where we can talk about some of the works that we've done without getting into the really detailed stuff. So that's a real challenge, and something that we're always battling with. Fortunately, we've managed to find a happy medium in a few scenarios. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely different in different regions. It's definitely different in different company sizes. It's definitely different in different sectors of that. But yeah, for sure, one of the things that we're constantly looking at is how do we get more people participating in growing the narrative? Because all of a sudden, when you see people now that are scrambling with data center pushback and the mainstream media and communities blocking data center development, I think a lot of it has to do with co-opting and delegating and abdicating some of that narrative and some of that brand building over time. And depending on associations, depending on media companies, depending on conference producers, to do some of the lifting that most companies, even at a relatively modest size, should be able to build out on their own.
Like I say, it does make the job is obviously made very difficult, because part of our kind of thought leadership sort of long-term engagement program is all around evidencing the work that we've done. Because it's award-winning, it's industry-leading. We want to be able to talk about it, but obviously that comes with certain restrictions. So it's a tightrope that we have to tread very carefully, naturally, but something that we're always keen to document, because ultimately we need to show competency. We need to show how good Rehlko and WB Power Services are, because we truly are an industry-leading force. So it's very difficult.
And so many of these demonstrations of competence used to happen in earlier stage conversations that just aren't happening in earlier stage conversations anymore. So if the content and the events don't fill that gap,
they don't.
Someone else will educate your prospects.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, we're very fortunate. We have a really strong team that focus on, like I said, the really early kind of advisory services at the start. Then we've got a brilliant team that do the kind of the business development, the more traditional business development stuff, and then engineers that come in and do the more technical stuff when you get further down that process. So we've got some really talented people at those different touch points in that journey that can build that and demonstrate that competency. Obviously, it's just putting it into a public facing piece of marketing activity or a campaign is sometimes where it becomes a bit more difficult.
Yeah, a lot of big culture issues, alignment issues, getting C-suite internal champions behind this stuff. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Rob, so much of the growth right now in the data center industry is coming from AI. I'm curious, as a hands-on marketing leader, do you have any favorite productivity tools that have been game-changing for you in the last few years?
I mean, we are the program line that runs through our entire marketing strategy is Salesforce. It's a strong CRM. All the way from your your kind of your capturing of data right at the start of that journey, your MQL stage, all the attribution that comes through kind of first touch of attribution when they land on your site, once they're in that kind of CRM funnel, those touch points, mapping those through Salesforce and getting that really strong picture and that qualification journey. And then once they kind of hit that threshold, passing them on to sales and seeing that prospect transition to an opportunity, what we call it, seeing those sales interactions and ultimately being able to see that entire journey, as I said, is incredibly important. So we've got Marketing Cloud for the marketing engagement side. We've got Sales Cloud, and then we use several other platforms for the channel specific stuff. So like your SEO, your search, and the other kind of areas that we focus on in terms of priority channels. But our kind of what we live for is that Salesforce journey, all the way from initial touch point through to long-term customer retention, and seeing maybe not so much it's very difficult in data centers because of that sales cycle length, but in some of our other critical sectors, seeing that initial prospect come in via a lunch and learn, seeing all those touch points through the MQL stage, seeing that qualification threshold hit and pass on to sales, seeing that sales engagement, and then ultimately seeing that opportunity turn into a conversion, and the revenue and the margin that we attribute back to those original campaigns. And then obviously, in working with contractors, working with M&E professionals, there's a long-term opportunity for kind of the lifetime customer value there is huge. So you can attribute all of that long-term revenue back to that original inquiry and those original touch points. So that for us is absolutely critical, and is what we live and die by.
The value of the data, being able to pinpoint exactly all the different points, how to weight them, prioritize, especially in a world where so many people are on devices now that are blocking cookies, and certainly GDPR influences all of this. Doesn't get any dark social.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if I said we haven't seen a significant traffic reduction purely because people just aren't accepting cookies. But that's the way of the world now. But you have to adapt. But it's a challenging time to be a marketer, but also a very exciting time.
And even people that I know that are in the very late stages of their career have all transformed to Google search, largely going by the way of generative AI search. So being able to not only make sure that you're present, that you're recommended on the topics, that you're cited, that people have a way, it's for sure changing a lot more.
Yeah, well, that's like I said earlier, at the generative AI kind of expansion and evolution of Google has completely reframed the game, and how we not only structure our data online, but how it's written, how it's presented. Gone are the days where you can build a landing page with target keywords and expect, you'll still get traffic naturally, but it's a much more informed, exploratory decision now, where people are using AI in those early informational stages, and it has completely changed how we do it. So we're going through a massive content transformation process now, and how do we adapt this AI? How do we adapt all of our thought leadership content, all of our on-page landing pages, how our conventional SEO landing pages? How do we pivot all of this for the generative AI and the AI optimization in the search engine space? It's a massive talking point, and something that is going to evolve further, I think. Real challenge.
And sounds like you had a really good running head start with it, already being pretty good at content marketing and thought leadership and understanding full journeys before this happened a few years ago. I come across companies in this space who never got good at content marketing and webinars and thought leadership and all of this. And now they're having to adjust to a reality where the ad inventory that they used to have access to just doesn't exist anymore.
Like I've said it a few times now, I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record, but understanding those customer journeys is that's half the battle. Once you understand that, you can leverage your resource to develop that content. I think few years ago, you would, a lot of companies as a starting point, they would look at, in their sector based on their kind of ICP, what are the top 100 keywords? Where can we build website landing pages? Where can we build a bit of content that will pull in some traffic? But now you can't get away with that anymore. You've got to be much more focused on delivering information as part of a broader search journey, where they're looking at data and evidence. The content that they're served is framed in a much more long tail, question oriented method rather than just a key phrase. There's a huge pivot here to making our content much more kind of goal oriented and outcome oriented for the customer rather than just targeting specific keywords.
And Rob, that's a great setup for the final area I wanted to ask you about today. How do you think the role of a data center marketing leader is going to change in the next 2 to 4 years when you look into your crystal ball? What's likely to stay the same? What's likely to be radically different for having this conversation 2 to 4 years out from now?
Yeah, I think because of 5G AI expansion, our messaging is the main message that we see all time and time again is a key selling point for us, and can be a pain point for customers is speed to deploy. Ultimately getting the infrastructure they need in place to scale, and we can do that through our modular power systems. We've just launched a new modular power system that ultimately is designed and built to save the customer time. So it's a modular power system that's built totally in-house from cradle to grave, end to end. So in that, within that product is all Rehlko components. So it saves time on construction, it saves time on labor. The commissioning time is low because we do in-factory testing. It's all pre-integrated. It's all Rehlko products. So that consistency of quality, the logistics are simplified, the risks reduced because of you're using a single vendor. So it's all about speed to market, and I think that ability to assist developers in scaling with modular power systems, and ultimately speed is going to be a massive. It's a huge point for us already, but it's going to grow even more. I think sustainability and storytelling around ESG is going to become core to brands' identities. We've got quite what I like to think is a really kind of clear sustainability strategy in place with a really, really talented in-house team. We've got our purpose is creating an energy resilient world for a better future. So we've got really clear goals in mind for sustainability. I think it's our Rehlko's sustainability goal is to reduce Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 90% by 2045. So we've got a really clear pathway there, and I think sustainability as a talking point is going to be much more prolific, where customers are going to expect clear statistics, around sourcing, carbon reduction, all that kind of stuff and certifications as well is going to be absolutely paramount. And then I think more just around trust, responsible AI energy use, that's going to increase exponentially. They'll want transparency around commitments on responsible AI usage and ethics, and then finally, just I guess as we do a lot of already, but that reliance on a marketer on the trust point is all going to be focused around that content that builds the trust in that engagement phase of the journey and long term as well. So your case studies, your real time data, proper evidence, white papers, all the stuff that's going to build that trust with the customer and the prospect. So I think that's probably where the sector's going. And I like to think, at WB Power Services, at Rehlko, and some of my really fantastic new colleagues, we're in a good position to tackle those challenges head on as we kind of move forward.
And as data center developers are finding out globally, their aspirations and power realities are joined at the hip with trust. If the communities don't trust them, if the elected officials don't trust them, if the utility companies don't trust them, if the regulators don't trust them, everything comes to a grinding halt.
Yeah, you're not going to get very far, right?
Yeah, so really, really insightful to hear how all of that comes back full circle, especially with ESG, especially with reducing Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions in the coming decades, and really, really interesting to get your take on how this is all being orchestrated by marketing. Robb, if someone wants to follow what you're working at or reach out to you or learn more about WB Power Services or Rehlko Power Systems, what's the best resources? Is LinkedIn or the website the best place to start, or do you have any favorites?
I mean, you can give me a shout on LinkedIn, no problem at all, or you can reach me through the website. Any methods, no problem at all.
Is there a favorite social media channel for someone that's a developer that wants to learn more? LinkedIn?
LinkedIn, yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, we'll include links to your profile and the company page and the website as well for anyone that's curious that wants to learn more. Really appreciate you joining me today, Robb. Really super fascinating perspective to see how you started in construction, moved over into facilities and power and engineering, and how you're really investing aggressively in understanding and optimizing for the full journey to get WB Power and Rehlko in both early and often, and being seen as a thought leader in this space. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Robb.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Today I've been speaking with Robb Shingles, who is the group head of marketing for WB Power Services and Rehlko Power Systems in the UK.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.